Okay, good morning and welcome to the 2021 GSHA Virtual Business Meeting and Conference. We hope you are enjoying the conference so far. So please be sure that you are muted and your video is off. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation using the chat box only. And please direct your chat questions to me as the host or to everyone, but try not or do not direct the questions to the speaker because I'll take all the questions at the question hour. Okay, it is my pleasure and indeed honor to present Ms. Virginia Sanchez. Virginia is a historian, author, and independent scholar living in Colorado. Her latest book, Pleas and Petitions, Hispano Culture and Legislative Conflict in Territorial Colorado, was published by the University of Colorado Press in 2020. She is also a contributing author to Nación Genizaria, Ethnogenesis, Place and Identity in New Mexico, published by the University of New Mexico Press in 2019. Her first book, Forgotten Cuchareños of the Lower Valley, received the 2011 Miles History Award from History Colorado. Virginia's presentation will be about the impending insurrection in Conejos, Colorado Territory, 1862. Okay, with that, Virginia, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you all for your time this morning. I know that you have lots of other presentations that you could have listened to, and I appreciate you being here for mine. We're going to share the screen. So I'm going to talk about an impending insurrection in Colorado, and this is southern Colorado. I'll show you a map a little bit later, but this insurrection was supposed to be as great as the 1847 Taos Massacre. And if you're not familiar with that massacre, or what was called that insurrection, by that time, General Kearny had imposed American law in New Mexico, and he placed Charles Bent as governor, and they started making all of these new laws that were very effectual to the Hispano people. So we had an insurrection of some Taos Pueblo Indians as well as Hispanos, and the town of Mora was actually bombed. And, you know, it was just a terrible period in time. And so I want you to think about that in the background here. So Conejos, Colorado, would be this lower area. I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, but then if we're looking at the lower part of the map, we have the San Luis Valley, and Conejos is within the San Luis Valley. Now, in 1859, we had a lot of miners coming into southern Colorado, what is now southern Colorado. They were here obviously to discover gold. They had encroached on Indian land because Colorado was the land of the Utes. And I want to acknowledge that too, that the land that we are now on in Colorado was the land of the Utes. Now, when the miners came in, we have US soldiers who are protecting them against the Ute Indians. Of course, you know, the country was interested in the gold and riches that were here. And then we find that these miners were coming from the eastern states. They were mostly single, and they kind of created their own laws. And these laws would actually state if an infraction occurred, what would happen to them. And in doing these laws, they then established some miners' courts that were also called kangaroo courts. So they didn't wait for legal justice, they just handled it on their own. Now, the miners that came in decided that they would create what was called Jefferson Territory. And this is a map of what they created. They included parts of Nebraska Territory, Utah Territory, Kansas Territory, and also New Mexico Territory. Now, the thing is, in this part, in the lower part of the map that you see, there were 3 counties that they created. They automatically marked them and said one is the Conejos, the other is Costilla, and then the third is Huérfano. Now we know Huérfano from the Huérfano Butte, Costilla from the Costilla River, and Conejos from the Conejos River. So these were big river valleys that were there. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, why did they include the southern part? In the southern part of their map, why did they include this northern part of New Mexico? The miners were already seeking statehood, and in order to have statehood, they would need 60,000 residents within their new territory. To get that number, they included what was New Mexico. Excuse me. So Congress gets wind of what they're doing, and they say, no, we're not going to let them create their own territory. This is an issue that Congress will take care of. So by 1860, we still have the notch here on this map that you can see. That's the top part there, highlighted in the green. Right, there's 7,000 Hispanos who are living there. And you'll see if you're looking at this map, that's Sangre de Cristos and the Culebra River, the Costilla River, and whatnot. So New Mexico Territory sends its delegate, Miguel Antonio Otero, to Congress, and he is telling the congressional members that, no, you really shouldn't think of moving the people from this area into the new Colorado Territory that they wanted to establish. And one of the congressmen says that he's really looking at establishing a new territory right in the middle of a map of the United States. And he wanted that territory to be square. Well, Colorado Territory, it was not actually a square, it was more rectangular. And then Otero is saying, no, you really shouldn't move these people because they are essential to New Mexico. They are essentially Nuevo Mexicanos. And he said, they shall be free to continue where they presently reside. And he referenced the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that was created after the US war with Mexico in 1847. I mean, that ended in 1848. And he said, if you do this, they will petition to return to New Mexico. He said, give them the option, give them a vote. And with no vote of the people in 1861, on February, Congress decided to create a new territory that was called Colorado. Now, 7,000 people woke up the next morning and they learned that they were in a new territory that would be run under Anglo rule. And the majority of the Coloradans then, excuse me, we have a lot of smoke still here in Colorado. So, you know, just as Otero had said, you know, these people these people are Nuevo Mexicano because they are Spanish speaking, they are rich in tradition and culture, and they are accustomed to a bilingual legislature. So once they got into Colorado, they elected their 2 representatives. And I'll tell you more about that a little bit later, but I want to tell you that by 1861, we are having all of these issues coming. So we've got the miners who are at the top of the circles there. Then we have the Fort Garland soldiers. Now, the Fort Garland soldiers were there to protect the miners and to protect the citizens from the Utes. We also had during this time the Santa Fe Trail going on. So in Huérfano County, now remember that Las Animas County was not created yet, where Trinidad is. Now, Trinidad was the site of the mountain branch of the Santa Fe Trail. So at this time, by 1861, Trinidad was just a new area, not very many people in it at all. It really didn't get established until 1866, but Trinidad area was also included in the map that I had previously showed you. So we've got Fort Garland soldiers. We have, the country is in disarray because the South is wanting to secede. And we have a lot of new soldiers that are coming from different parts of the eastern states. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So we have a lot of recruitment going on, and there's a lot of movement of troops from Fort Lyon, which is by Bent's Fort, and then we got a lot of movement into Fort Garland, and from Fort Garland into New Mexico at Fort Union. So we've got all of this traffic going on that's going through. Now we've got the Ute Agency that was created in 1860, and the named agent was Lafayette Head. So he is trying to get, the agency was just nearly moved from Abiquiu and into Conejos. So the Indians are getting used to now coming into another area that they're familiar with. But the problem is that the government has not yet provided them with enough rations. So the Hispanic settlers are asked to provide them with blankets and with wheat and with any beef and sheep. And we've actually found records that of how much money went out to the Hispanics, and we have 4 receipts that we have found. Then we've got the New Mexico Territorial Legislature, as I said, was a bilingual legislature. So that that chamber had a paid translator, and they also had federal funds to print the laws both in Spanish and in English. And then we have the 2 land grants. So what I'm trying to say with all of this going around this circle is that there was competition for the land. The Conejos grantees were trying to get their land grant confirmed by Congress by 1860. Now they had, that land grant was actually issued in 1833 because the Ute Indians did not want these settlers on their land. The Conejos grantees, for their safety, moved back into what was then the northern province of New Mexico. Now, the Sangre de Cristo land grant was owned by Charles Beaubien, and he had invited settlers to actually live on his land grant. His was an individual land grant, whereas the Conejos land grantees were a community land grant. And the Sangre de Cristo ran into, excuse me, Charles Beaubien was able to get his land grant confirmed by Congress. So everything was working out for him on that side. However, the miners and the new settlers were starting to encroach on these 2 land grants. And because there were some problems with the deeds that Beaubien had issued to his settlers, and of course the Conejos grantees were having problems getting their land grant confirmed, we have the issue of squatting onto the land and the concern of the Hispanos of losing their land. And as I mentioned, the Colorado, the Civil War was started 1 month after Colorado became a territory. So we've got a lot of that movement coming in, and we also have a lot of recruitment that's going on. So we have the fear of the Texas Confederates coming into Colorado and wanting to take the gold. There's this fear all around. Now, in the Colorado Territorial Legislature, we have a lot of laws that are being passed, and I'll go into that a little bit later that you need to know about it. As far as what I'm introducing here is all of these all of these issues are coming forward, and there's a lot of concern of the people. So the two representatives that were sent to the legislature were Jose Victor Garcia, he represented Conejos County, and Jesus Maria Varela represented Costilla County. Huérfano County at this time had a majority of Hispano settlers, residents. And unfortunately, that county did not send a Hispano representative to represent them in the territorial legislature. And there's some study and research that's going on about that, because it appears that some of the ballots that were distributed throughout that county didn't include all of the correct names. So I talk about that a little bit more in my book. Now, Victor Garcia actually had represented the Northern District of Taos County in the 1858 territorial legislature of New Mexico. And both men were Spanish speaking. And William Gilpin was appointed by President Lincoln to preside and govern over the new territory. Now, Gilpin knew about the San Luis Valley. He knew that they were predominantly Spanish speaking, and he was ill prepared for the arrival of these two gentlemen when they came to the legislature. So when they arrived, there was no interpreter for them, and the interpreter was found 3 days later. Meanwhile, the chamber is passing all of these laws that they're not able to interact on, and they had issues with the interpreter because there were misinterpretations. The person didn't know about the cultural issues regarding this southern counties, and then they could not even choose an interpreter of their choice. There was a lack of, because of these issues, there was a lack of real representation. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the laws that were passed. And I'm going through all of this to let you know that these issues are building up, these issues are building up, and people are a little concerned. Now, Victor Garcia and Jesus Maria Varela had asked for a translation of the House rules. Now, the rules of the House are like a parliamentary procedure pamphlet, and it's, could be a one-pager at that time, for who knows. But they had asked for a translation, and it was denied because the territory didn't have any funds. And the territory was so new, it's true, it did not have any funds. However, when the miners started bringing in some revenue, then is when William Gilpin transferred some funds for his Colorado volunteers. And those were the men who actually went into New Mexico and fought in the Battle of Glorieta. So, we see that Gilpin has misused some funds. He's not using the funds properly for the people itself. I mean, he did for his own, I'll say his own name and his own breed. And luckily for New Mexico, that the Colorado volunteers did help with the Battle of Glorieta. Now, I mentioned that there were no federal funds for the Spanish translations of the laws. William Gilpin never asked the federal government for some money, so that was an issue. So these laws that are enacted, that first session, 36 private acts, memorials, resolutions, and then several civil and criminal codes that were taken from the laws of Illinois. Well, the two senators obviously the two representatives obviously don't know about the laws of Illinois, so it was very difficult. And again, not having a translation of the laws of Illinois, then we don't know about these civil and criminal codes. Now, the types of laws also enacted some taxes. So there was a property tax, a federal tax to fund the Civil War, and then the roads and highway tax. Now, the Hispanos were accustomed to a barter society. So if I have eggs, I'm going to trade you for some loaves of bread, that type of bartering. In order to pay their taxes, they needed hard cash. And in order to have hard cash, they were either forced to sell their land, to sell their belongings, or to sell their property. So here we start to have a lot of people very concerned about what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to their families. Now, I mentioned the road and highway tax because this was an important one. The territory wanted roads to get the miners in and out, and to get the gold in and out of the mountains. This road tax said that every able working man over the age of 18 would pay a $5 tax yearly for this road and highway tax. Now, if that person could not pay the $5 tax, they were asked to, or they weren't asked, they were forced to work 2 days on the roads and highways, and they were supposed to supply their own tools. Now, Hispanos were needed on their fields, and because they were subsistence farmers. What they grew was what they ate. They were not big money makers on their land, and so this road and highway tax was very detrimental to them. Now, the land conveyance law. Remember that I mentioned that Charles Beaubien of the Sangre de Cristo Land Grant had asked his settlers to come and settle on his land. Now, if you weren't asked by Beaubien, you were a squatter, and he took care of getting you out of there. So he was growing older, and he decided that he wanted to give the settlers that he had invited actual deeds so that they could stay on their land and have access to La Vega, which would provide them with wood, grazing land, and hunting. So he made out these deeds in Spanish, and he gave them to his settlers. Well, the land conveyance law that the legislature passed in 1861 said that they had to be in English, that these deeds would have to be in English. They would have to have some kind of a survey, and it was going to be in acres, not in varas. And also that you would have to have on your deed your legal Christian name. Well, obviously, Beaubien didn't do that. And so his deeds that he had given to his settlers were null and void according to that land conveyance law. So by 1862, we've got the county assessor who is having problems is having problems with the settlers because they're not paying their taxes. All right, then he asks the clerk, which is John Gaspar, and they're agreeing that there's problems that, these Hispanos are not paying their taxes. Now, when you don't pay your taxes, you're seen as not being a good citizen, and you're not being seen as being very patriotic. So when the miners came in from the east, they saw these Hispanos as being newly arrived Mexicans, and they saw them as not being citizens of the United States. Now, remember that after the U.S. war with Mexico, by 1848, those who stayed on the land were considered citizens of the United States. So these Nuevo Mexicanos were citizens of the United States. However, certain people were not viewing them as citizens with full rights. So then going back to this date, July 30th, the county assessor Hendren and Gaspar, the county clerk, agreed that there's going to be, a revolt. The Mexicans are not recognizing the laws of the territory, which is paying their taxes. So the next day, Merchant W.F. Postoff writes a letter to Major Meyer at Fort Garland, and he says the Mexicans are threatening rebellion. There's reports of secret meetings. That's followed by the next day, and I'm sorry you can't see this, this is August 4th, or can you see that? Ed, can you see that August 4th slide?
Yes, we can. I can.
Okay, good. All right. So again, William Postoff, the merchant, sends a letter to Major Meyer, and he says that this time Postoff has spoken to Indian Agent Lafayette Head, and Lafayette Head confirms about the steps to take in case of a revolt. And that Meyer writes to, or Postoff writes to Meyer saying the revolt appears imminent. And then in this letter, Postoff also alludes that he wants to unseat a certain territorial legislator. Okay, 4 days later, William Postoff again to Major Meyer, except this time it's not just one letter. He sends 2 letters on the same day saying the Mexicans are troublesome, they're holding secret meetings, and they're hostile to our government. Major Meyer then sends a letter to the New Mexico Military Department, and he says he's going to hold Company J of the 2nd Cavalry at Fort Garland just in case. On the 18th, Major Meyer sends another letter to the New Mexico Military Department, and he says that he had met with prominent Mexicans of the settlements and that they assure him that they are loyal to the government. And he also writes, all of which I do not believe. So unfortunately, we have no other records of this period of time except for these letters. But this is a telling tale that the Anglos were getting very, very suspicious of the Nuevo Mexicanos. And so something's brewing. So then we take a look at military reports as well as newspaper reports. On September 3rd, the newspaper reports that Territorial Representative Jose Francisco Gallegos is found on the Conejos Plaza with a rope around his neck. Now that's all the newspaper says, but you know, we're presuming that Jose Francisco Gallegos is deceased by this time and that he was lynched by a mob. Okay. The following day, the newspaper reports there's a low threatening murmur still continue, and the Mexicans are still upset. All right. The following day, secret meetings are being held with armed sentinels before the door. All right. Now what happens is Major Meyer decides to take some troops to Conejos. And there he bursts into a secret meeting that was armed by sentinels. And there the settler, not the representative, but the settler, Jose Francisco Gallegos, shouts out, "The laws ought not to be enforced and shall not be," as he holds his arm or rifle or musket. Okay, now Major Meyer attempts to arrest Jose Francisco Gallegos when Antonio Gorgonio Galvez, Jose Aniceto Martinez, and Jose Nazario Gallegos come to Francisco's aid. So now the military is very concerned, and we see what happens next. On November 6th, the Fort Garland soldiers returned to Conejos and they seized 2 muskets from Gallegos. On November 7th, according to the newspaper, 2 more muskets are seized and a Hall's carbine rifle from 2 more Mexicans. Then on December 27th, 1862, soldiers are sent to Conejos to compel obedience. Now I should mention that the soldiers were also concerned about something happening in Conejos County or Costilla County. However, the newspaper reports were coming out of Conejos by the U.S. Marshal. The U.S. Marshal was the actual newspaper consultant, or correspondent, and he was writing these correspondence to the newspapers. We don't have newspapers in Southern Colorado that tell us how the Nuevo Mexicanos were feeling. So that's an unfortunate part, but we do have these newspapers from Denver and Pueblo and Colorado Springs that are telling us what's happening. One of the newspaper correspondents uses the pen name Dornick, and he is actually a miner from the Colorado Gulch mine. And he is known for creating some of the miners' code. And he is also a person that had written a lot of pejorative statements about the Nuevo Mexicanos and their land, and that the newer immigrants from the East would make the land more profitable, and the Mexicans are selling it for cheap. Now, Dornick was actually Wilbur Fisk Stone, who went on to be a territorial justice, and he also went on to serve on the Court of Private Land Grants in 1891, which actually defeated the Conejos grantees' efforts to try to get their land grant confirmed. Now, back to December 27th. All right, when the soldiers come to Conejos to compel obedience, they arrest the four gentlemen that I mentioned, Francisco Gallegos, Gorgonio Galvez, Aniceto Martinez, and Nazario Gallegos, for treason and resisting law by force of arms. Now, by 1863, we've got the Enosa brothers who start supposedly a mass killing in March of 1863. And so we don't know how they're connected with this insurrection that's supposedly happening. However, and I won't go into that story, I talk about that a little bit more in my book. But by 1863, we've got this military census that is showing us exactly what arms and ammunitions the men have in Conejos. So there's 135 pounds of powder that's supposedly to go to 50 rifles, 73 carbines, 44 pistols, 29 muskets, and 24 shotgun. Now, think about this. These people are still using muskets, and a musket is an old type of arm, and you don't see very many, well, you don't see any US soldiers with those kinds of arms and ammunition. So I want to stress that these people are still using these antiquated arms, and the reason that they have arms in the first place is to protect them from warring indigenous tribes or bands, and they're using these types of arms and ammunition for hunting and protection. So they're not out to create any kind of insurrection. There's 330 men, and here, these are the men that could be conscripted into the war. This military census came out of an order from the New Mexico Military Department, and the order was strictly to see how many men of age could be conscripted into the Civil War, how many arms and ammunition they had for protection against the Confederates, and also how many oxen and wagons and land and sheep and wheat could be confiscated by the federal government should the Texans come forward into Colorado territory. Now, among these Conejos settlements, we had 294 families, 135 horses, 76 wagons, 505 oxen, 16,000 sheep, and 17 fanegas or bushels of wheat. So the people are now really getting concerned that the US government is going to confiscate their goods. The territorial law wants them to pay their taxes in cash. New coming immigrants are wanting to sit on their property and take ownership. Now, remember, by 1862, we've got the Homestead Act, which opens up the West to new settlers. So this is really a volatile period that I'm talking about. And I also want to mention that this census obviously didn't take a tally of the number of bows and arrows, but the people of southern Colorado were still using bows and arrows by this time. It is documented in Olibama Tushar's book, and it's documented in several oral histories. So what were the secret meetings for? And why was everybody upset, and what was going on? Well, just as Miguel Otero had predicted in Congress, he said the people are going to want to petition to return to New Mexico. In 1862, that is exactly what they were doing. I suspect that these secret meetings they were trying to get their petitions together. There were also secret meetings in Costilla County, but again, as I mentioned, the newspapers only reported those of Conejos County. So why did the people want to return to New Mexico? Well, the new impact on the order, the new and the different laws, the laws were not being printed in Spanish, so they didn't know what their taxes were going to. They were taxed, and by paying their taxes, they had to lose their land, they lost their livestock or personal property. The fines imposed, if you could not pay a tax, you had a fine of 25 cents for each year thereafter. And so, the fines were even detrimental to them. Now, meanwhile, their representatives at the territorial chamber are not able to fully represent them. So these taxes are really imposed on them without equal representation. Then their free labor is asked to be used on highways and roads. And the people had a connection to New Mexico, what is called querencia. They had a connection by land, they had a connection by ancestry, they had a connection by language, by religion, and by customs. Now, the secret here is that these petitions were to return to New Mexico with their land. So at this time, we have other newspaper accounts that are saying, well, yeah, you guys can go back to New Mexico. We have no problem with that. Go ahead and go. But they wanted to keep the land. So, by simply moving to New Mexico without their land was a defeatist. These were people who had settled these land grants, and they had worked and labored on the acequias that they dug to get water to their land. And by selling it, or with the new settlers coming in and taking the land, they didn't have to do anything because the acequias were already bringing water to that land. So this was the big thing. Obviously, we don't have an insurrection based on what I explained, that there weren't enough arms and ammunition to do any damage. And besides that, I mentioned the three forts that were near: Fort Lyon, Fort Garland in the San Luis Valley, and Fort Union in New Mexico. Had there been an insurrection, the army would have been right on them, and they would have been many loss of life. So there's fear that there's going to be an 1847 type of massacre. Who has fueled this fear? That is the merchant, that is the newspaper, that is the newspaper correspondence, and there's distrust and rumor and prejudice, and there's taxation without representation, as I mentioned. Now, if we go back to what Francisco Gallegos, the settler, had said, the laws ought not to be enforced, and they shall not be. All right, this is, he has his right to say this by the First Amendment of the Constitution, the US Constitution. However, you have to remember this is a time of civil war, and anybody who spoke out against the government was seen as it was seen as an act of treason. So we've got that going on. I want to mention a little bit about Francisco Gallegos. And this is the settler, not the representative who was hung. All right, the settler was married to Delavino Jacas, and they were from Abiquiu. He later married Juana Sanchez in 1861 at Conejos. And now Delavina Jacas was a daughter of a Conejos Land Grantee. So by his marriage to her, they owned 220 acres of land. Now, when Jose Francisco Gallegos was arrested for treason, they confiscated his land, as well as, you saw, his arms and ammunition. So there was a warrant out for his arrest, and he was arrested. These 4 men were arrested and taken to jail at Fort Garland. Now, somehow, some way, they escaped. And we don't know how, because the records aren't there. However, you know, it could have been a bribe. It could have been simply that these soldiers had a little bit too much alcohol, weren't paying attention. And I need to say something about that. Fort Garland was a way out of the way post. And it was said to be one of those posts where you didn't want to be at. There are accounts at Fort Garland of a lot of alcohol being used, and that there were problems with the alcohol. So, you know, I did want to mention that because that could be a possibility of how these 4 men escaped. Now, the charges against Jose Francisco Gallegos were later dropped. Antonio Gorgonio Galvez was married to Paula Lobato, and they were from Ojo Caliente. In 1859, Gorgonio was a member of the Guadalupe Church Committee. By 1860, he is a sergeant in the Conejos militia, serving under Captain Jesus Maria Velázquez of Conejos. Now, in 1860, this militia is actually going out to battle against the Navajo. And the people of northern New Mexico had decided that they had enough with the troubles with the indigenous bands, and they weren't going to wait for the U.S. Army to help them anymore, because by the time the Army got there, their sheep had been taken or whatnot. So under Captain Jesus Maria Velázquez, this militia is started, and here we have Gorgonio Galvez named as a sergeant on the militia muster roll. By 1864, Gorgonio is a probate judge. And by 1864, he is among the 22 Hispano petitioners requesting the removal of Indian agent Lafayette Head. And I'll talk about that a little bit more a little later. Lafayette Head has been credited with bringing the first Hispanos into the San Luis Valley, when it was actually the Jacas family who had done this. Lafayette Head, he is rumored to make his money off of Indian captives. And we don't know, we don't have any records of him actually posting the bond for these trade license. But we do have records from Kit Carson, who was at Fort Garland. And he has given out a couple of trade licenses, and those were made out to Antonio Jose Vallejos and Jose Celedonio Valdez, and a number of people. And these trade licenses also give the 3 men who are basically under them. So these men are listed as their leaders, and then the men under them. And it only lists the three main men. These trade licenses allowed them to go onto the Indian land and legally trade with them. Now, the trade licenses also state that these men, by signing their name or placing the X, that they will not trade contraband with the indigenous bands. So contraband would be liquor, arms, and ammunition. Okay, so we don't know that Lafayette Head was posting bond for these men, for these trades, but we know that when you went out to buffalo hunt, when you went out to trade with the indigenous bands, that likely there was going to be some trade in human captives. So we do have this happening, and by 1865, Lafayette Head is reporting to the governor about Indian captives, Indian captivity within southern Colorado. Now, the Hispanos are a little upset with him because, of course, their names are on this list, but Lafayette Head's name is not on this list. He doesn't include several Indian captives living in his household, and he says that he didn't include them because they belonged to his wife and because she had done it out of the goodness of her heart. So, you know, we have this thing going on with Lafayette Head. He's already told the merchant, Postov, what to do in case of a revolt. And Postov is worried because he has these little stores everywhere, and he's worried, obviously, about his merchandise. So Lafayette Head is also in trouble with the federal, or I should say the U.S. Army. The Indians go to Fort Garland, and they actually say that they don't have enough food, and that Lafayette Head's interpreter doesn't speak Ute. So this is another problem. So the commander of Fort Garland at that time goes out and he interviews several of the Hispano people, and he's asking them about what Agent Head is doing with the provisions. And they're actually saying that he is selling some of the provisions to them. I'm trying to remember the name of the one man who actually states in a hearing that Lafayette Head had given him some bacon, and his neighbor went to go get bacon from Lafayette Head, and he says, no, I can't give this to you because this is saved for the priest. So the government holds a hearing, the U.S. Army holds a hearing, and they determined that Lafayette Head has been selling Ute goods, but the governor is on his side, and so he's not going to do anything about it. Also, Lafayette Head is a presidential appointee, so it can only come down from the federal government as far as moving him along. Lafayette Head was the longest running Indian agent in Colorado, and he was, by the 1870 census, he was the wealthiest man in Conejos County. Okay, so let's go down to Jose Aniceto Martinez. He was married to Maria Josefa Madrid. They married in 1851 in Abiquiu, and then he later married Isadora Rodriguez and had a number of children with her. And then in 1891, he married Eduvigan Lucero from Conejos. I mentioned this information as we're talking to a genealogical society, so any of their descendants, if you please contact me, because I'd like to know a little bit more about these men and their family history. Now, Aniceto Martinez was also a soldier in the Conejos militia of 1860. Nazario Gallegos was from Abiquiu, and he married Maria de la Luz Sanchez in 1842 at Arroyo Seco. He married Andrea Garcia in 1844 in Taos, and he was also married to Malda Trujillo in 1851 at Taos. By 1862, he is a Conejos County prefect or judge, and this would be a probate judge. 1862, he's a witness at the hearing of the charges against Lafayette Head. And in 1863, he is a witness to each of the Beaubien deeds given to the settlers of the Sangre de Cristo land grant. Now, as it turned out, they had determined that Nazario Gallegos was not officially by official capacity supposed to have been, what I'm trying to say is he was not in an official capacity to be working with those deeds. Now, I suspect that he was helping Gaspar, Mr. Gaspar, the county clerk, translate the deeds. But as it was determined by law, he was not in an official capacity to do that. Okay, so we talked about muskets, we talked about the soldiers coming to arrest them and compel obedience, and that they were arrested for treason and resisting the law by a force of arms. We also have discovered that they wouldn't have had enough arms and ammunition to do any damage, and that that was more detrimental to them, loss of life, had the soldiers been coming from the two other posts. And I also want to mention that going back to bows and arrows, the newspaper accounts in 1863 that discuss the Espinosa brothers, Felipe and Viviana Espinosa. Supposedly, when Major Meyer had gone to Conejos to arrest the two men, he went and supposedly the Espinosas had ducked back inside. They grabbed their bows and arrows, and they're firing their bows and arrows as they're carrying their arms and ammunition out the door to run. And this is the account that the newspaper says. So they're firing off their arrows while carrying their arms and ammunition out the door. Okay. You cannot fire a bow and arrow while carrying something. It's just not going to happen. So again, we know that the people were using bows and arrows at this time. It's a fascinating story about the Espinosa brothers, and I think they get a bad write-up. I think there were too many issues going on, as I've mentioned in the circle. We've got issues with the Utes not having enough food. So in order to get food, they are raiding the sheep. The settlers get upset, so they call the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army sends their troopers. You know, it's just a mixture of a lot of things happening at one time, at the same time here in 1861, 1862, and 1863. So we know that the military was in a position of power. All right, whenever they came, people reacted. When the New Mexico military district had asked for a census of Conejos, they went to each settlement, and this was Major Archibald Gillespie, and he went with an entourage of troopers. So when they entered a small Hispano settlement, it was already a lot of fear because, number one, are they here to arrest us because we haven't paid our taxes? Are they here to take our possessions because we haven't paid our taxes? Are they here to take our men because they're trying to conscript them into service of the Civil War? So then we have this comment from Kit Carson. All right, he says, "It is here also that the last wave of Mexican semi-barbarism meets the advancing tide of American progressive civilization, producing as it mingles a clash of language, laws, and customs, a diversity of mistrust and influence, which renders the presence of military surveillance and police both necessary and judicious." I want to also mention that in 1863, we have the Ute Treaty that's being conducted by the US federal government. And there are no more than 500 US soldiers in and around Conejos at the time. Now, where the treaty was held is supposedly near Lafayette Head's compound. Now, Lafayette Head's compound is only about 300 feet from the Conejos Plaza. So we've got the Ute Indians that are all around. We've got 500 soldiers that all around. They're looking for the Espinosa brothers, which is 24/7. And we've got all of these other things that are going on. The miners are still coming in. New settlers are coming in. People are upset that they have to pay these taxes and work the highways and roadways. And they're also upset with what's going on in the legislature. Now, by 1864, the representatives, Hispano representatives, had asked again for the laws to be printed in Spanish. They take their case to the federal government. They have their Celestino Dominguez is a Spanish national who is in Colorado, and the two representatives ask him to write a letter in English for them. Now, Celestino Dominguez later becomes a territorial senator, and he appears and disappears as quickly as we have no more records of him after 1864, which is very suspicious. Celestino Dominguez is the one who actually writes a letter to U.S. Treasurer Whittlesey by way of the Colorado delegate Bennett. And they ask for federal money to translate these laws in Spanish. U.S. Treasurer Whittlesey responds to the letter saying, the custom of the government has been to encourage foreign-born citizens to acquire a knowledge of our own language, and hence in the territories, the laws have been printed in the English language, except in New Mexico, where such printing was done by an act of Congress. Okay, let's back up here. Foreign-born citizens. These, by this time, they are not foreign-born. They were born in New Mexico, and by 1848, they were citizens of the country. Okay, then only in New Mexico where such printing was done by an act of Congress. Whittlesey is the U.S. Treasurer, and he fails to realize and fails to recognize that this area was taken from New Mexico to create the southern part of Colorado Territory. So right off, they get this letter that says, no, they can't do it. But also I think it's a slandering letter because, it insults them as being not foreign-born, not citizens, and that they're foreign-born and that they should already have learned English. We've been speaking Spanish in New Mexico for 400 years. It's ingrained in us as part of that querencia. It's our homeland, the land of our ancestors. We have a rich history. We have a rich ancestry, Native and Mexican and Spanish. So, that is a part of the querencia. So just as Otero had predicted, these people wanted to be returned to New Mexico with their land, and it just wasn't happening. Now, the territorial delegate, Bennett, knew what Whittlesey had said and that he had declined, but also the delegate failed to inform Whittlesey that he was incorrect about these people. Now, Delegate Bennett had been informed by the governor and the other legislators not to let this bill to return New Mexico, to return this land to New Mexico. He was told not to let that bill happen. And the reason for that was that Colorado wanted statehood. They were going for statehood and they needed that population there. So these 7,000 people that had first started as the first settlers, and by now, 1864, that population obviously had increased. So they needed that increase in population so that they would have 6,000 people to become a state. Well, obviously, Colorado didn't become a state until 1876. But it's still important to realize that these were all of the things going on with that. So there was no massacre, okay? There was no insurgent activities. Everybody got out of whack. You know, the stars were not in alignment, or they were in alignment, whatever. Either way you want to look at it. You know, rumor, distrust, prejudice, news reports. The problem with taxation was really big, and you know, the positions of power where you couldn't say anything without being sought as treasonous activity. So that is basically it. I wanted to bring you up to date on what was happening with Conejos at this time, and how this massacre had been worked up so much, but it actually didn't occur. And it didn't occur because there weren't enough arms and ammunition to do any type of and the people were so afraid to do anything. So so it didn't happen. But you can see by all of the things that I have mentioned in this presentation that this was fueled by a lot of fear. Okay. And that is it for now. I wonder how much time we have with that. And I'll just, here's the way how you can contact me. Again, I'd love to hear from the descendants of Galvez, Gallegos, and Martinez. So if you've got any information for me, please contact me. This book, Pleas and Petitions, covers all of the information that I pointed to, and it is available in hardcover and paperback, and also it is available in ebook from the University of Colorado Press.com.
Okay, well,
now
thank
I'll
you.
turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. I really enjoyed that. So now we'll open it up to questions. So if you have any questions, just send the chat to me and I will ask Virginia. Here's our first question, Virginia. When were these particular lands settled by Gallegos, for example?
I'd have to go into my database to see, but they were here by 1861 when the first election was held. Each one of those four men were in Conejos or in Costilla by 1861.
Okay, good, thank you. Next question, are all of your books, Virginia, listed in your speaker's biography that I think was available to the GSHA participants?
Okay, Forgotten Cuchareños is a book about Cucharas in Huérfano County, and that book is rather important in that it when these people were losing their land in Conejos and the Sangre de Cristo land grants, when they were losing their land there, then is when we see this big migration of people going over to Huérfano County. So by 1866, we have these settlements in Huérfano County, and Cucharas is one of those. And I mentioned Antonio Jose Vallejos, who had a trade license. He appears in Conejos with his enslaved Navajo. So that's a story about Cucharas that I thought I'd mention. That one is published by the History Press, or now Arcadia Press, and they're available from me or online distributors or booksellers.
How many books have you written, Virginia?
I've had two published. I've got one self-published, but it's more a reference book on indigenous captives or enslaved persons in Southern Colorado from 1860 to 1870. Okay. And anybody needing a reference or want me to do a lookup on an enslaved indigenous person within a family, I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you.
And that research was for Southern Colorado only.
Sure. Okay, here's another one. What are some of the items and places you researched to learn all of this information?
I went through the Colorado magazine, and they are available online through the Hart Library of History, Colorado. And I went to archives. Denver Public Library has a really nice collection of oral histories from the Spore Leader. And Spore Leader was out of Huerfano County. He took some really good oral histories that are there that you might want to take a look at. Let's see, the Huerfano County Oral History Project occurred in 1979, and that's a lot of those are online via the what is that, Huerfano County Resources page. So if you go to the Huerfano County Resources page and then just do a search on oral histories, it'll pop up, and then you can go through and read a lot of those. A lot of reading. Looking at magazines, I get the New Mexico Historical Review, and I also go through, as I mentioned, the Colorado magazine, archives, all right? Libraries and museums in Southern Colorado. The Pueblo Library was really great. The Denver Public Library Western History section is really great. I also went to the archives in Washington, D.C., in Maryland, and in the Rocky Mountain one in Denver, or now it's in Broomfield, I believe. But, these are wonderful records. Take a look at the microfilm that's there for the military records. Take a look at the microfilm records for Agent Head's report on indigenous slaves. The only thing about Agent Head's report is that he says that he interviewed all of these Indians and asked if they wanted to be returned to their tribe. There's only 10 that say that they want to be returned, which is very curious. Now, by 1865, the Navajo are still at Bosque Redondo and confined down there until 1868. By that time, they're starting to come back. And in some cases, by the 1870, the indigenous enslaved person is no longer there. So if they're Navajo, they may have already returned to their tribe. They may have married and taken on a different name. And the unfortunate thing about Agent Head's list is that he doesn't include the indigenous name. So these are already indigenous slaves who have been renamed by the Catholic Church, and they're being acculturated into Spanish and Anglo society, because not all of the owners were Hispanic. There were several that were Anglo. And so there's this acculturation that's going on, and these enslaved Indians, lose their culture, they lose their name, they lose their language, they lose their identity, which is very sad. Let's see, going back to records, I enjoy reading, I enjoy history, I enjoy Southern Colorado. And so I pick up books here and there. And I also use the library. It's expensive to buy books. So what I'll do is sometimes I'll ask the library if they have a copy of a certain book. If they don't have it, I ask them if I can get it from a different library, and they'll find it for you. So that's nice. Get a library card and start using it, guys. And then I find that if I really, really enjoy that book, I will buy it. And then I take copious notes on things that I read. I have a database. I use Family Tree Maker. And so when I found the name Gorgonio Galvez, I looked him up. I do the genealogy. I try to find out, look at the census, find out what they were doing, where they were living, take a look at their church records, marriages, baptisms, deaths, seeing what's impacting. And so I'm tying that all together. that's why it takes me so long to write a book. But anyway, I really feel that each one of you have a story to tell. And it's by doing the genealogy and researching the time period of when your ancestors lived and what was going on during the period of time. You know, I heard about the Espinosa brothers and I said to myself, well, something had to be happening during that time. And I set out to do that research, and that's what led me to that circle that you saw, and I'll call it the spoke of a wheel that, you know, said that all of these other things were happening at the time. And that's what you need to search for, and that's where your story is. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Next
Hi,
one.
Ruth. I see you there.
Were the African American soldiers at Fort Garland involved in these repressive measures?
They were there much later, I think by 1868. So it was much later.
Okay, thank you.
And I may have the date wrong, but I think that's much later.
Okay, this is from Kathy. I bought and read Virginia's book, Pleas and Petitions. I found a connection to one of the assemblymen, Juan Miguel Vigil. He was my great-granduncle. In the book, you state that he chose not to support reannexation of Conejos and Costilla counties to New Mexico Territory. Is he the same person mentioned in Nación Genesada as J. Vigil, owing a captive, which would explain why he chose to vote Republican?
Okay. There are two issues here. Okay. He may have changed his mind and said, no, I don't want Conejos to be part of New Mexico. And he may have changed his mind. And a lot of people did, because at this time, the railroad was coming through. So the railroad was great for if it came through your area, because you could sell your wool and ship it back east. You could, we weren't big cattle growers then, so we were relying on the wool to make us a lot of money. A lot of people, you know, had started to work for Anglo farmers, and but there was money coming in when the railroad came in. There was work with the railroad that you could do. There was so what I'm trying to say here is that a lot of people in Costilla County had changed their minds and did not want to be returned to New Mexico because of the fact that they thought they could make some money with the railroad coming in. The other part, you'll have to email me with the name again, and I'll do the lookup for you and see if the legislator was the one that had the captive in enslaved indigenous. Okay.
Okay, thank you. This is more clarification on one of your books. Was that the name of your book, Survivors of Captivity, Genealogies of Known Captive Indians in Southern Colorado, 1860 to 1880, and where can we buy it? Okay.
That one is more a reference book. I really don't recommend you having it on your bookshelf because it's not going to give you a lot of information unless you have more than 20 captives in your family, okay? I will gladly do lookups for you, and I can send you the pages. I'm willing to do that for free, so that's no problem. The book is in several libraries, the Denver Public Library, the Pueblo Library, Adams State Library, and several other libraries. So check with your library first. It's only a reference book, so you can't check it out, and then obviously email me and I'll help you. I'll help you with it.
Yeah, Joy also says she's trying to get it for a library, so I guess she's having trouble.
Okay, all right. I have one copy left, so contact me.
Okay, great. This is from Jeanette. Were most of the enslaved Indians from the Ute tribes or many different tribes?
Most of them were from the Navajo. Most of them were Navajo. And I didn't bring that with me. I'm going from memory here. So we have a lot of Utes and Comancheros who were preying on the Navajo. All right. And that's why we have a lot of Navajo. Now, there's several issues too. By that time, 1861 to 1868, the Navajo are being rounded up and taken to Bosque Redondo. Bosque Redondo is in southern New Mexico, and it was a reservation set up for them, but it had poor water. They couldn't grow. Traveling down there was treacherous, and they lost lots of family members. Once they got there, they were dying of disease. I mean, the horrible things were happening. So as word got passed around, some Navajo that knew that they were going to end up at Bosque Redondo had decided that they would leave some family members with trusted Hispanos. All right, now we're saying that happened because some of these are very young, and by looking at the head's analysis of where they were purchased and whatnot, a lot of them were purchased in the San Luis Valley, some in New Mexico, some in Utah. There's one that I found. I did my own research and found that Lafayette Head did not include every captive in Conejos and Costilla counties. So I found more, and I also looked at Las Animas County and Huerfano County, and so we find a lot there. One of them was even out of Arizona, and place of birth was called On the Plains in New Mexico. Their ages are listed on this analysis. The chapter that I wrote for Nación Genízara talks about Lafayette Head's list, and I include a lot of ums here. I include a trade route that I found out of oral history. So they congregated at Conejos and met some other people south in New Mexico, and then they traveled all the way past the canyons into Hopi territory. So there was a raid that was there, and in that chapter I name all of the Comancheros that are listed in a New Mexico record, and several of them were from Conejos.
Great. Okay, are there any other questions? Here's another one. Regarding the Espinosa brothers, one item reported stolen from a murdered farmer, supposedly stolen by the Espinosa brothers, was a vest embroidered with flowers. In the book by James E. Perkins, Tom Tobin is pictured on the front cover wearing that embroidered vest. What do you make of that?
I've not heard about that vest being part of the items that the Espinosas robbed. I did participate in a podcast for History Colorado, and it's going to be on the Espinosa brothers. I will post that on Facebook and on the GSHA Facebook page also, to let you know when that podcast is going to be. It also includes some different views about the Espinosas. Mine is one, and of course other people have their views too, but it should be an interesting podcast, and I'll let you know when that comes out. I think it has to do, I think the troubles started at the California gold mine in near Leadville, and I think things got off from there. We just don't know. But the beheading of the Espinosas was truly violent. And I mentioned Territorial Senator Celestino Dominguez. He writes a letter to John Evans, who's now the governor, in 1864, and he actually says, 3 of our peaceful people have been violently murdered. And then he goes on and he attributes Lafayette Head as the cause, which is quite interesting because of the date and how it has to do with, this insurrection and what's happening with Lafayette Head and what's happening with the Espinosas. So it's an interesting letter that kind of just makes you open up your eyes and think, wow, what else is going on? I hope I answered that question, but I do not remember or having seen something about that vest.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Well, if not, I want to thank our speaker. Thank you, Virginia, for a very wonderful presentation. And I want to thank our audience as well. Thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time in listening to my comments on Conejos, and it's Costilla County and Conejos County and Huérfano County and Las Animas County are very, very important in our history.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Good afternoon.